Paul Evans. The Democrats served 8 operations in the Air Force, including Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. He is reluctantly supporting President Biden's decision and talked to me directly about the timing. You talked to Katu in early July. You said, quote, "I'm very concerned that we're leaving Afghanistan in a moment that is perilous." Have your feelings changed?
No. When we allow the Taliban to be seen as, quote unquote, legitimate and this new ISIS-K as the extremists, we've moved the pendulum so far to the wrong side of the measure that I'm very concerned about what that means for us in the future.
Speaking from his experience serving overseas in the Air Force, Oregon Representative Paul Evans reacting to this crisis in Afghanistan after 13 service members and at least 170 other people were killed in Thursday's bombing outside the Kabul airport. He told me the feelings are a mixed stew of emotion, part anger and part helplessness.
We have done the best we could as men and women who served. And unfortunately, the folks making the decisions with the highest pay grades, I think, sometimes lost focus.
Evans said specifically he's concerned about the way of life for women and children. He says he doesn't know any female veteran of Afghanistan who wouldn't go back, fearing those Afghans' lives are fundamentally worse under Taliban rule. But right now, Evans said the focus should be on saving those who are still there.
It isn't the time for second guessing right now. That will come.
Yeah, I asked Representative Evans what he thinks Oregonians need to better understand about this crisis. He said the focus right now should be on getting every American out, every Afghan who helped us in Afghanistan out, and everybody who wants out. He said then we can have a long discussion about when and where American military force is necessary and when it's not. Yeah, Catherine, I talked to Tillamook County Commissioner Erin Scarr. She told me that when they get overwhelmed, they send people to hospitals here in Portland. But even Portland is seeing a worrying rise of its own in its ICU and its hospitals. So it's a widespread crisis that's happening right now. Tillamook County commissioners met in an emergency this week. The coronavirus outbreak in their community at levels they've never seen.
We are in a dire crisis.
County Commissioner Erin Scarr tells me they felt like they were in a bubble for much of the first 18 months of the pandemic. And now
it's a very different feeling now than it was in the first 18 months, where we just felt like, hey, we're safe, we're rural, we're small, we tend to have distance in what we do naturally. There was just a sense of safety that is now gone.
In the past week and a half, the county says they've more than doubled the number of COVID-19 deaths from 5 through most of the pandemic in Tillamook County, now to 13 total.
As a result, with other things happening in the county, this is putting a huge stress on our local funeral home.
And that might be the most tragic indicator. The death toll is forcing the county to bring in refrigerated trucks to hold the bodies as the death toll rises.
I think that people feel so safe in our little communities, and I think that was a wake-up call.
And that call to the community is growing more stressful as I asked Scarr what responsibility these commissioners have to slow the spread.
We continue to make vaccine available. We continue to educate. We continue to encourage. And it's a very challenging conversation in a small rural community.
Yeah, if there's one positive in all of this, Commissioner Scarr told me that they had hit a real low in the number of people signing up to get vaccinated before this latest surge. She said they were averaging about 5 people a day going into their clinics to get the shot. That is now up to about 30 to 50 people today. So people protecting themselves by getting the vaccine in this coronavirus crisis.
Yeah, that's right, Catherine. A school district in Culver City, California became the first in the country to mandate vaccinations for students in school. And we heard from the president of one of the largest teachers unions in Oregon, who's saying that Portland should consider doing the same thing.
We were in favor of the vaccine mandate for ourselves, and teachers are very supportive of a mandate for students.
The president of the Portland Teachers Union says they'd like to see a mandate for all students able to receive a coronavirus vaccination.
We know that we have a long history of mandated vaccines in schools, like the mandate for measles. And what makes vaccines work is that when enough people are vaccinated, it protects the most vulnerable among us who can't get the vaccine.
I've asked the Oregon Department of Education to weigh in on this topic, and they sent me a press conference from 10 days ago where they said the following to parents.
So with face coverings, all of the practice protocols that our schools had in place last spring, and these added vaccination protections for the adults in the system, we believe we can do well.
But in the 10 days since that press conference, the FDA has fully approved the Pfizer vaccine, and we've seen more and more Oregonians get hospitalized with COVID. So has that perspective changed? I reached out to the governor's office. Here's what they told me. Given the current situation in Oregon and at this point in the pandemic, we're not ruling out any options. That being said, at this time, we're not actively considering a vaccine requirement for students over the age of 12.
School districts cannot do this alone. We need leadership from our state, from the counties, from the cities, because we're all in this together.
Portland Public Schools starts on Wednesday. Teal says she's concerned that it'll be a year filled with quarantine, cancellations, and possibly illness if action isn't taken as soon as possible.
I would first of all urge every family who has a student who's eligible for the vaccine to get it right away so that we can start school with as many students vaccinated as possible.
But the question is just as much whether or not school districts should mandate vaccinations, but also, Catherine, whether or not they can. I reached out to the Oregon Department of Education, the governor's office, and spoke to a local attorney about this. We're going to have much more coming up at 6.
Well, Catherine, the acting director says they are required by federal law to look at each situation individually. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But for people who do not qualify for key exemptions, those benefits could be off the table.
The Oregon Employment Department tells us when it comes to benefits in the COVID-19 vaccine, they'll review each and every case.
One of the key things that we look at is whether the issue involved is a reasonable expectation on the part of the employer. And I want to be clear that this isn't the Employment Department making a value judgment as to whether it's a good or a bad policy. We give employers quite a bit of leeway to run their business the way they want.
The acting director says when looking at benefit eligibility, they're considering if the standard set by an employer was a reasonable one.
In broad strokes, requiring somebody to be vaccinated during the midst of a worldwide pandemic is a reasonable policy. So if somebody doesn't follow that policy and they don't have a good reason, it very well could result in their not being eligible for benefits.
There are a few key exceptions. That includes someone having a medical disability that means they should not get the vaccine, or a, quote, sincerely held religious belief.
Here in Oregon, nearly all K-12 school employees and healthcare workers must be fully vaccinated against COVID by October 18th. Employers who do not comply could face fines.